First bill up is House File 607, and Representative Schultz will be. The motion would indicate that this will be held over for possible inclusion. Would you like to make the motion yourself, please?
Sure, I move House File 607.
All right.
Okay.
You can begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a grant program that will help low-income families and students afford a public education at our 4- and 2-year MNSCU and University of Minnesota higher education institutions. And this has a companion bill in the Senate. And other states right now are also moving forward on legislation that's very similar. So the grant would help cover the difference between the tuition and fees, and would exclude any amounts they get through Pell Grants, state grants, or other scholarships, so it would pay that difference. And it would be, I don't have the fiscal note on this, it won't be ready until tomorrow. But I do have information on the cost that they've estimated in New York, if people would like information on that. And as you guys know, students are struggling to pay for college, 2-year and 4-year. And the average debt load in Minnesota is around $29,000 after they graduate. Right now at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where I teach, we even have a food shelf for students, which is becoming more popular around the country as students, even though they're working, are struggling to pay their living expenses. I believe 13% of college students are even homeless, and 20% report on a survey that was done in Wisconsin of being hungry and not having enough money for food. And so you see that it's more common that universities are starting food shelves for their own students. So the affordability is a problem. I'm calling this bill sort of the Minnesota Miracle Squared bill, where we invested a lot in our K through 12 system, which was the Minnesota Miracle. I think we need to start thinking about investing in higher ed to make sure we have a world-class workforce that attracts businesses to Minnesota, and that we can compete globally in cutting-edge technology, STEM areas, even in liberal arts. So I'm moving this bill forward. I hope we can talk about this after we get a fiscal note as well. In the state of New York, their estimate, which is a very similar program, was $163 million. And they're covering a lot more people in their program, so ours would be much less than that, I hope.
That's an annual cost?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And it's only for students in Minnesota?
It's only for residents of Minnesota. There's also information in the bill about needing a certain GPA. So the students would have to meet that GPA to be eligible for the grant. It would go through the FAFSA system to check on eligibility. And they have to maintain a GPA of 2.5 on a 4.0 scale and maintain academic progress in this area. Otherwise, they would lose the grant.
Okay, questions? Who? Oh, Representative Haley, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. When you mentioned the New York estimate was $163 million, for Minnesota, do you know how many students this would serve?
I would know if we had the fiscal note. I tried to delay this bill hearing, but apparently this bill wanted to be heard today. So the fiscal note will contain that, and I will send that out to the committee once I get it, which should estimate the number of students that would be eligible. So it's not, I know that if the state of Minnesota paid for everyone who was eligible to enroll in college, and we paid for all college expenses for any income limit, the estimates I've seen, it would be $734 million. That's for everybody. This grant is income-based, and it has a GPA requirement and a residency requirement. And it only is for public institutions, so the University of Minnesota and MNSCU institutions. So the top limit is $700 million to pay for everybody's college costs, and that's regardless of financial aid. New York's, it was 940,000 households had college eligible students, but I didn't have a number on their income, in the households that would qualify based on their income, but we should know that tomorrow.
Representative Daniels?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many times can they renew that grant? Is it renewable then?
The way that the bill is written, it is a statutory appropriation, meaning the program would automatically receive the funds required to provide the grants. But Mr. Williams might be able to have more information on that.
Mr. Chair, Representative
WD
Daniels,
40.
to the best of my knowledge, there's no limit written in language in the bill so as to how many times a particular student could renew a grant under the program.
Any other questions?
Okay, here's
Right,
some
okay.
information, Chair. So it says
Okay,
in the,
go.
in subdivision 6, the grant may be renewed annually, so the student could reapply for the grant if they met the eligibility requirements.
Representative Pryor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talk about New York. Are they currently doing this program, and do they have a history then in New York of the kind of the if it's working, basically? Are people getting through school quicker? Are they getting through school with less debt and issues such as that?
This is being proposed by the New York Assembly, so they haven't implemented it yet, and they phase in the income requirement. They start with the $100,000 annually, and in 3 years move up to the $125,000. So our bill is a little bit different, but no, they have not yet implemented the program.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Pryor, do you have a follow-up? Okay. Christensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Schultz, do you have any estimates on kind of how future costs would go as enrollments, I think, would likely shift from private schools to public schools if this program were going to go into place, which would increase the cost of the program? Do you have any idea of predictions or how extensive those shifts would be for fiscal planning?
Schultz?
I'm just estimating, guessing this, a guesstimate. I think there would be some shift, but I think if students really wanted to go to a private school and the private schools can maintain their scholarship programs, that they would still continue to go to those private schools even though there was money available for publics. But I'm sure there's going to be some shift, but I don't see it as a significant. And we want more residents to be going to our public institutions. And at one time, the state covered a third of the tuition cost, and over the last 20 years, we've seen a significant decline. So in some regards, our public institutions are becoming private institutions because of the low level of state funding. And I think we have to get back to a point where we're helping our state institutions and helping students afford college.
Christensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Representative Schultz, you mentioned that we want more students to go to our public institutions. I think it's great for students to go to public institutions. I went to a public institution. I went to the University of Minnesota. But why do you think it's better for students to go to public institutions than private institutions?
We want our Minnesota, I think the argument is that the Minnesota residents rather than non-residents, we want to have those slots available to more of our Minnesota residents rather than non-residents going to our public schools and institution. And this grant would allow them an opportunity to go to our public institutions in Minnesota. Rather than, so the option could be they could go to a public institution or a private outside of the state. This may help keep our Minnesota residents in Minnesota going to our schools and hopefully staying in Minnesota once they graduate.
Christensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Schultz, are you concerned that this is going to, in some ways, box students that are maybe not the highest achieving, but certainly college material students, kind of box them out of college in Minnesota as enrollment shifts to public schools from private schools, which I think, you didn't seem to think like it would be that large of a shift. I think it would be a pretty extensive shift if you could save that amount of money, if you could essentially go to free college at public schools. I think it'd be a really extensive shift. And as those students take up slots at public schools, obviously the public schools are going to take the highest performing applicants. Are you concerned that some middle-of-the-road students might be boxed out of college, out of our public schools, because it's filled with all of these people that are coming in from private schools?
Yeah, I think,
Schultz?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think that based on the demographics in the population, that we're going to have more open slots in our public institutions for students. because of the change in our aging demographics. So I don't see that as a problem. I also think I think it's a good question. I think where we can look to see when we increased and implemented the state grant program, to see how much it shifted once that program was implemented. And we can ask for that information to see what the shift was after we implemented the state grant program, to give us an idea of what to expect if this was actually implemented.
Christensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Representative Schultz, who do you kind of see as the target of this program? Who do you think it really benefits the most?
Schultz?
Well, I think it benefits students and their families to help afford schools. So those families who are not available to set aside savings for their dependents. And I think it also benefits those students who are independent, because that threshold is $75,000 or less to afford school. So many students will qualify through FAFSA, the FAFSA process, and Pell Grants, but there's still quite a bit of expense in terms of tuition and fees that they cannot afford. So it will definitely help those students who are middle income, low income, afford college and have an opportunity to go to college.
Christensen, are you done?
Yeah, couple more questions, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Chair, Representative Schultz, do you have any kind of an idea on, so I know you don't know kind of the exact costs of this. Do you have an estimate? Do you think it'll kind of fit within our current budget in the legislature in the state of Minnesota, or do you think we'll need to raise taxes in order to pay for it?
Boy,
Schultz?
well, I think if we think long-term and not short-term, that this will have a huge payoff to the state if we invest in educating our workforce, and meaning in terms of bringing businesses here, having people be able qualified for jobs that make more money, then they pay more in tax to the state, so it would increase our revenue. So I think we have to think this is a long-term investment, like our Minnesota Miracle. This would be the second wave of that, but focused on higher ed. I really wanted to wait and present this after the fiscal note, so I would have it. I'm a data person, so I like to have that information, so I apologize that that note wasn't ready today. But I can give you, I don't know where it's going to fit in the budget you guys develop, but I hope we can have those conversations early so we can start thinking about what sources of revenue we could use or raise to invest in Minnesota and our workforce.
Christensen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just last one. Well, I just think it's really important that we're thinking about that we have an idea of how much this is going to cost. I think it's important, obviously within the amount of revenue that the state of Minnesota is currently raising. I mean, I don't really see, it's obvious that this would be a very, very expensive proposition. I understand, obviously education is critically important. It's an investment, but, I don't know, I don't really see that there's a way to do this without raising taxes, and I'm just, kind of interested in what kind of tax increases you think would be the best way to pay for this.
Schultz? You have an
Mr.
answer?
Chair, Representative, I'm not going to go on the record saying that we might need a tax increase. I think there's other ways to pay for higher education, that we can reduce our spending in other areas or become more efficient in other ways. But I think once you have your target and you have your budget, we are doing very well economically. And my concern is that other states will move forward in helping fund their workforce, and we will lose out on attracting businesses to Minnesota.
I will add
Christensen?
one more. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, Mr. Chair. One more question. So I think I'm encouraged by your openness to reductions in spending. So I'm just curious about what some of your ideas are for spending reductions, because they'd have to be obviously really significant spending reductions in order to pay for this.
Well, we spend a lot right now on health and human services, so I think that's an area where we could look at. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars on insurance, and right now that's not really working for our Minnesota population in terms of getting affordable health care. So I think there are savings in health and human services that we can move from there if we make some substantial reforms, and your party's in control, so I'm eager to work with you on those reforms so that we can move that money over to higher education.
I know you have a testifier. We have a couple of more questions coming, and then we'll get to the testifiers. That's
Sure.
okay? Representative Heitzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see in, I think it's subdivision 5, satisfactory academic progress. There's some discussion of some thresholds there for folks that they must maintain at least a C+ during their first academic year. And I'm wondering, a question actually had come up in the MinSCU system. At what point would you maybe step in and say, we need to make an adjustment? And I'm wondering if in this language, there are some protections that are built in, like say, for example, you have a student that does maintain a C+ average, yet they continue to take a class over and over and over again. Does a taxpayer continue to pay for that student for whatever reason? I'm not sure what the issue might be, but are there any protections there or anything built into this language?
Schultz?
Mr. Chair, Representative, so I don't know, as a professor, I don't know why a student would want to keep taking the same class over and over and over. Sometimes they take it over if they fail a class or they get a D and they want to increase it to a C+. And some institutions do have limits on how many times they can retake a class and how they can retake that class. So I would rely on the institution's policy to help us guide us on maintaining the 2.5 GPA. So I don't think it's in the interest of students to keep retaking a class.
Heitzman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for example, if you have a student, and anybody that has taken a college class has noticed folks that for whatever reason, maybe they are not interested that semester and they move on to the next semester, and maybe again, they're not interested and they continue to just drop out of the class, and maybe personal reasons, or maybe who knows what the reason might be, but wouldn't it make sense to have something built into the language that would allow some kind of a control there, rather than just continuing without any consequences, a student to continue to just drop out and then take it again and drop out? That's going to be a very significant cost, and if there's no control mechanism built in, the institution may, as you suggested, have a policy, or maybe they would just continue to allow that to happen, and there's nothing there to protect the taxpayer.
An example might be somebody going into medical school and their grades aren't quite good enough. They'd have to retake and hopefully improve the grade. I assume that's one case where you'd want to take it over at least once.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative, so this is only for undergraduate education. This does not apply to graduate education or professional schools like a School of Medicine. And this is geared for full-time students. So students that are struggling in one class are often struggling in other classes and would have a really hard time maintaining a 2.5 if they are struggling, even if they retake that class. So I guess I'm not as concerned that we would have hundreds of cases like that, or even one case where, I think it's okay to have a student try to retake a class. If that semester they fall below a 2.5, they're not eligible for the grant.
Heitzman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, there's got to be some limit to the generosity of the taxpayer, and there's got to be some opportunity for them to take responsibility if they're not completing a class, yet maybe overall they maintain a C+ average. They could, under your language, continue to take a class, it's paid for, drop out, and that process could just go on and on. Where are the controls? I don't see any here in the language.
Schultz?
Well, I'm happy to work with you on that language, Representative, on tightening it. But I think if they're not considered a full-time student, if they drop below, if they drop that class is not considered in their credit load. So they would not be able to continue and wouldn't be eligible for the grant.
All right, Representative Pryor, you're next.
Thank you. I was thinking more about this. So it's this idea, though, that we are then doing something that would be in the country, some of the first adapters of this kind of program. And so I guess there's two questions I actually have right now, if I may. it seems to me that it would be good to follow and see, which institutions students are choosing to go that are getting these grants to cover full tuition, and that you kind of like the measures of success, so that we would know whether or not what we intend to do with this is working or not. If there's not other models that give us that data right now to say that this is a good investment, a good bet on our students, because based on what we've heard already, we know that there's needy students that are falling behind, that are not able to stay on track for graduation, and they're the ones that are going to debt and are not being able to benefit from our post-secondary institutions, and that we need those kids. We need them to get good educations, and we need them to do it in a timely manner. And then my second question, if I may, is I know that if I had all the statutes here, I could look it up, but if you don't mind just letting me know and summarizing when you say satisfactory academic progress. And actually, I think this may have been what Representative Heisman was trying to get at, is to know that students are on track for graduating on time and not wasting time in college. And that's what I think maybe one of the things that we want to make sure that we're addressing. And I think probably that statute would let us know, if this is being covered right now.
Bill?
So I think Mr. Williams is ready to answer that question, Mr. Chair.
So, Mr. Chair and Representative Pryor, the existing definition of satisfactory academic progress for the purpose of other state financial aid programs cross-references to the federal regulation on this topic related to federal financial aid programs. I'm not familiar with the details, but I know that there's requirements that you complete a certain number of the required credits over a particular period of time and in a certain number of years. And if the committee would be okay with it, I can follow up offline with sort of more details on what the definition of satisfactory academic progress is.
Representative Pryor?
Mr. Chair, Representative Pryor, so I understand the concern, and I think right now, at least at my institution, University of Minnesota Duluth, we see poor rates of graduation in 4 years and the higher levels of student debt on average than the national average, because students are working so many hours, so they have to delay graduation, or they can't be full-time, they have to be part-time. So I think helping them pay for schooling, we're going to see huge improvements in graduation rates 4 years and GPA levels as well.
Representative Pryor?
And I guess that would be what I would like to see in the legislation, though, is that we be able to document that change. And so that we know that if we're making this choice, if we're making this investment, that we are getting kind of the return on the investment that we expected.
And Mr. Chair, Representative Pryor, so the universities, for accreditation purposes, document all of this information, so we would be able to, if once it's implemented, we can go back to iPads, get all that information, and evaluate the effectiveness of this program if it was implemented, definitely.
Representative Heitzman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Representative Pryor's comment, what I was specifically driving at is in the MnSCU system, MnState now, if you take a class and you're a student who happens to have some aid, there's a threshold to protect the taxpayer. So if you take it twice and you are not able to complete the class, currently you don't get help with the third time. You'd be on your own dime, and that would be that would be to encourage folks to make sure that they're not taking advantage of a system, and that's not present in this language.
Okay, any other, maybe we should call on your testifier now? That'd be,
Sure, thank you.
Joseph Wolf, is that, that's who he is, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Good. Welcome to the committee, and identify yourself for the record, and then proceed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Nornis, committee members, for allowing me to testify, and I am glad to be back in front of you today. My name is Joseph Wolf. I'm a student at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and I'm the state chair for Students United, an organization which represents all Minnesota State University students. I'm here today to testify in support of House File 607. This bill would provide much-needed financial support for state university students. Many of the students I represent struggle to pay for their education, both during school and after graduation. Despite taking steps to financial tuition, books, and living expenses with work and available financial aid, the average Minnesota University student graduates with over $31,000 in student loan debt. But it is not uncommon for State University graduates to leave our institutions with over $40,000 or even $50,000 in debt. I personally am above the debt average and owe $39,600 in student loan debt. Many of my friends and classmates take as many credits as possible in order to graduate on time while also working 1 or 2 part-time jobs, with some working over 40 hours a week. Many State University students receive little or no family assistance. As you can see, students have to borrow as much as it takes to complete their degree and set them on the right path for their career. This bill would provide a much-needed grant for students and would reduce college debt. Thank you, Representative Schultz, and all the sponsors for supporting State University students in this bill. And I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Wolf? I thank you for being here
Absolutely.
and for waiting, being patient. I think we have probably discussed the bill extensively, and we have Representative Leon next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Schultz, I do appreciate you bringing this forward. Now, I will say I'm not a big fan of free college. I just don't see that it's completely sustainable, in the long run. I think people do have to be paying in some of their own money for this. But I really appreciate you bringing this forward. I appreciate you looking at different solutions, different ways to help people achieve an education, help the state grow its economy. And furthermore, when we're talking about, how much is this going to cost? Are we going to have to raise taxes? What are the protections for the taxpayers? Well, I think that's kind of missing the point here, because ultimately we need to get a handle on tuition. We need to get a handle on student debt. It's the #1 source of personal debt in this country, and it's crushing our economy, so to speak. So I think really the point is the real protections for the taxpayers, the real protections for how much this bill is going to cost is with us. It's with the legislature, and it's with this committee. And so when we have the systems coming in, MnSCU or Minnesota State, the U of M, the privates, we need to be asking them, what are you doing with these dollars, whether it's tuition dollars, whether it's state appropriations? Are they going into administration? Are they going into bonuses? Or are they going into the classrooms? Are they going into students' actual education? So really, that's for our job to do. And again, I just appreciate you bringing this bill forward and looking at different ways to help people get an education and help our economy grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and
Any
Representative.
final words?
Sure. So this doesn't make college free, because students still have to pay for their living expenses if it's in a dorm, and they have an opportunity cost of going to college, because if they cannot work full-time, that is their opportunity cost. So it's definitely, it helps them, but it's not completely free.
The chair moves that House File 607 be held over for possible inclusion. And thank you, Representative Schultz.